The light in that living room was perfect, golden, warm, spilling across hardwood floors that still smelled faintly of fresh varnish. And my mother-in-law kept saying how much she loved it, how she could already picture herself sitting right there by the window every morning with her coffee. My father-in-law nodded along, agreeing with everything she said, and Barrett stood between them with his hands in his pockets looking more pleased than I'd seen him in months. I should have felt happy too. It was supposed to be our first home, the house we'd been saving for since we got married. Instead, I stood a few feet back from all of them, watching the scene unfold like I wasn't really part of it, my stomach twisting in a way I couldn't explain. And that's when Priscilla, our realtor, touched my elbow gently and said, in a voice pitched low enough that only I could hear it, "Can I talk to you in the other room for a second? There's something about the paperwork I need to go over with you." I didn't think anything of it at first. Realtors pull you aside all the time to check details, confirm numbers, make sure you understand what you're signing. I followed her down the hallway into what would have been a home office, my mind still half on the conversation happening behind us, my mother-in-law's laugh carrying through the walls. Priscilla closed the door softly. Her expression had changed completely from the polished, professional smile she'd worn all afternoon. Now she just looked worried. "I need you to leave," she said. "Today, as soon as you can, without making a scene." I actually laughed, thinking I'd misheard her. "Leave? What do you mean?" "I mean this house, this deal, all of it. Something isn't right, and I think you need to know what I've seen before you sign anything." She glanced toward the door like she was afraid someone might be listening. "I'm sorry to spring this on you like this, but I couldn't let you walk into that closing without telling you first." I stood there completely frozen, my heart suddenly pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, unable to understand what she could possibly mean. Whatever it was, I could tell from her face that it was bad. And the strange thing is, some small part of me, some part I'd been ignoring for 3 years, wasn't surprised at all. My name doesn't matter for this story so much as who I was, a 30-year-old woman with a steady job in medical billing, a modest savings account I'd built up slowly since college, and a husband named Barrett who I'd married 2 years earlier truly believing, that I understood exactly who he was. Barrett and I met at a mutual friend's engagement party when we were both 27. He was funny in that self-deprecating way that made you feel like you were in on a secret joke, and he talked about his parents constantly, how much he owed them, how hard they'd worked, how his mother had sacrificed everything to raise him after his father's construction accident left him unable to work the way he used to. I thought it was sweet, actually. A man who loved his family that deeply, who felt that much responsibility toward them, seemed like exactly the kind of man who would take marriage seriously. His father, whom I came to call my father-in-law, had fallen from scaffolding on a job site when Barrett was 19. He shattered his hip and did permanent nerve damage to his left leg. His mother, my mother-in-law, had thrown out her back trying to catch him as he fell, or so the story went, and had lived with chronic pain ever since. Between the two of them, work had become nearly impossible. They lived off disability payments and a small settlement from the construction company, and Barrett had spent his early 20s helping support them however he could, delivering pizzas at night after his day job, picking up extra shifts whenever they came up short. I met them for the first time about 4 months into dating Barrett, at their house on the edge of town, a little rambler with a wheelchair ramp built out crookedly onto the porch. My mother-in-law answered the door, leaning heavily on a cane, her smile warm and a little tired. "You must be the one Barrett won't stop talking about," she said, ushering me inside. "Forgive the mess. Some days are harder than others for me." I noticed right away how carefully she moved, how she winced when she lowered herself into her armchair. My father-in-law emerged from the back hallway a few minutes later, dragging his left leg slightly with every step, using the wall for support. "Don't mind me," he said with a laugh that seemed to cost him something. "This leg has a mind of its own most days." I'd brought a homemade lasagna, still warm in its dish because Barrett had told me his mother loved Italian food and rarely got to have it anymore. When I set it on the table, my mother-in-law's whole face lit up in a way that genuinely moved me. "Oh, we haven't had a proper meal like this in ages," she said, already reaching for a serving spoon before I'd even finished setting out plates. My father-in-law was right behind her, and between the two of them, they'd served themselves generous portions before Barrett and I had even sat down. "Hungry, huh?" Barrett said, half joking, reaching for the dish himself. Sorry, my mother-in-law said, though she didn't stop eating. "It's just been so long since anyone cooked for us like this. You understand, don't you, dear?" She looked at me with such genuine gratitude that any awkwardness I felt seemed petty by comparison. I told myself I did understand. How could I not? These were two people who'd had their bodies broken and their independence stolen from them in a single terrible afternoon, and here I was bringing them something as small as a lasagna, and it meant the world to them. It should have felt good. Mostly it did. except for the little details that snagged at me afterward on the drive home, in the quiet moments before sleep. The way my father-in-law had gotten up to bring us water, and I'd noticed the glasses were chipped, cloudy, clearly reused 100 times over, and the water itself had a strange, slightly metallic taste that made me suspect it hadn't come from a filtered pitcher at all. The way my mother-in-law, catching my hesitation as I drank, had said, almost too smoothly, "I'm sorry we can't offer you anything nicer. Barrett tells us your family's done well for themselves. Must be strange, coming from that to this." "It's not like that," I'd said, flustered, though I wasn't even sure what it was. No, I understand," she said, patting my hand. "It's hard for people who've always had things to understand what it's like when your body just stops cooperating with you. We do the best we can." My father-in-law nodded along solemnly, and I'd felt something close to shame for even noticing the water glasses in the first place. I told myself, over and over in the months that followed, that I was being unfair, that my discomfort said more about my own privilege than about them. Barrett clearly loved his parents with an intensity that bordered on protective, and I admired that, even when it meant our plan sometimes bent around their needs without much discussion. When we got engaged a year later, he came to me looking almost ashamed, and said his parents wouldn't be able to contribute anything to the wedding. "That's fine," I told him honestly. "We'll use our savings. It doesn't need to be anything extravagant." I even asked my own parents to hold back on offering financial help, worried it would embarrass his family if the contrast became too obvious. We had a small ceremony in a rented hall with maybe 60 guests, flowers from the farmer's market, a cake my aunt made herself. It was lovely, actually, in its simplicity. A few weeks later, my mother-in-law called to apologize again for not being able to help with costs and said she wanted to send us something as a wedding gift. Some household items, she said, things they'd been saving for exactly this occasion. 3 days later, 4 large boxes arrived at our apartment. Barrett tore into them delighted like a kid on Christmas morning and pulled out an ancient stand mixer with a cracked bowl, a microwave with yellowed buttons and a door that didn't sit quite flush, a toaster missing one of its coils, and a stack of dishware, several pieces chipped, that I recognized immediately from their kitchen cabinets. "These are your parents' old things," I said before I could stop myself. "They still work," Barrett said, a little defensively, "and it's the thought that counts. We should be grateful they thought of us at all." I called my mother-in-law to thank her, mostly out of obligation, and mentioned gently that several of the appliances didn't seem to be functioning and that we'd probably end up buying new ones anyway. "Oh, that's such a shame," she said, her voice tightening slightly. "I wish we could have bought you something new, but you know how hard it is for us to get around, and shopping online is so confusing at our age. We just gave you what we had." I thought newlyweds would appreciate not having to spend money right away. When I tried to explain that I hadn't meant to sound ungrateful, Barrett had already heard about the conversation. She must have called him directly afterward, and he confronted me that evening with real irritation in his voice. "You complained about my parents' gift? They don't have much, and what they do have, they gave to us. That actually meant something to them." I apologized, though something in me resisted apologizing, some quiet, persistent doubt I couldn't quite name yet. We kept the old appliances. I used a cracked mixing bowl for 8 months before finally replacing it myself without telling anyone. It was around our first anniversary that Barrett started talking seriously about buying a house. Not an apartment, not a townhouse, but a proper single-family home with enough room, he said, for the future. I assumed at first he meant children, and my heart lifted at the thought. It wasn't until a few weeks into house hunting conversations that he mentioned, almost offhandedly, that he wanted somewhere his parents could eventually live with us. "Just in case," he said. "Their leases will run out eventually, and honestly, with their health, I don't feel right leaving them on their own long term." I understood the impulse, even respected it in theory, but something about the idea unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite justify out loud. I thought about the chipped glasses, the recycled appliances, the way my mother-in-law's tone shifted so easily from warm to wounded whenever she didn't get quite the response she wanted. I thought about how, on my last visit to their house, I'd noticed, almost without registering it at the time, that their kitchen had been fully renovated, brand new stainless steel appliances gleaming under new pendant lighting, nothing like the worn-out kitchen I remembered from a year earlier. "When did your parents redo their kitchen?" I asked Barrett that night. "A few months ago, I think." "Why?" "I thought money was tight for them." He shrugged. "They probably saved up, or got some kind of settlement thing finalized. I don't ask them about money, it feels rude." I let it go, the way I'd let so many small things go over the past 3 years, filing it away in some back corner of my mind where uncomfortable observations went to be quietly ignored. But it didn't fully leave me. If anything, it planted a low, persistent hum of suspicion that stayed with me through the following weeks as house hunting conversations continued, mostly without me. I found out we'd been actively looking at a specific property, only because Barrett mentioned it in passing over dinner, describing a house he and his parents had already driven out to see the previous weekend. "You went without me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "It just kind of happened. My parents wanted to see it, and I figured I'd tag along." "You'll get to see it this weekend. I already set it up with the realtor." I felt something cold settle in my chest at being left out of a decision this significant, but I told myself it was a small thing, not worth another fight. That Saturday, the four of us drove out together to meet the realtor, a sharp, composed woman named Priscilla Vaughn who greeted us at the property with a firm handshake and an easy, professional warmth. In the car on the way over, my in-laws had chatted with her like old friends, comfortable in a way that struck me as strange for people supposedly meeting a realtor for the first time. The house itself was stunning. A two-story colonial with a wraparound porch, a finished basement, a yard big enough for a garden, tucked into one of the nicer neighborhoods in town. My mother-in-law walked through the front door and immediately started talking about which room would be hers, how good the natural light was, how she could already imagine herself sitting by that big bay window every morning. My father-in-law nodded along with everything she said, adding his own comments about the layout, the space for a workshop in the garage. I finally worked up the nerve to interrupt. "This is my first time seeing this place. Can I get a brochure or the listing information?" Priscilla handed it over almost too quickly, like she'd been waiting for the excuse. The price hit me like a slap, well above anything we'd discussed as a budget, well beyond what Barrett's salary and mine, combined, could comfortably support. I looked up, confused, to find Priscilla watching me carefully, her expression giving away that she had something to say and was waiting for the right moment. My in-laws had already wandered out to the back terrace with Barrett trailing after them, deep in conversation about garden beds and patio furniture. That's when Priscilla touched my elbow and asked me, quietly, to step into the other room with her. The moment I'd started this story with, the moment everything cracked open. "I need you to leave," she'd said. "Today. As soon as you can, without making a scene." And then, seeing my confusion, she'd taken a breath and started explaining. She told me that Barrett and his parents had toured this property twice before, without me, and that both times she'd watched my father-in-law walk the length of the house and back without so much as a limp. No cane, no wall bracing, no wincing. My mother-in-law had climbed the stairs to the second floor without pausing once to rest, without touching the railing for support. "That doesn't make sense," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "They can barely walk most days. That's why they can't work, why they need help with everything." "I know that's what you've been told," Priscilla said gently, "but what I've seen doesn't match that. And there's more. When your husband submitted the mortgage pre-approval paperwork, the loan was filed under your name, not his, not a joint application, yours, specifically." She hesitated, clearly debating how much to say. "If you don't believe me about the walking, you can see for yourself. They're still out on the terrace." She led me to a cracked doorway that gave a partial view of the backyard, where my in-laws stood laughing about something, walking easily across the uneven stone path, my mother-in-law even bending to pick up a fallen branch without any visible discomfort. I stood there, stunned, watching two people move with a fluidity I'd never once seen from them in 3 years of knowing them. "Record it," Priscilla said quietly. "Just in case." My hands were shaking so badly it took 2 tries to open my phone's camera, but I did it, capturing maybe 45 seconds of my mother-in-law and father-in-law walking, laughing, gesturing freely with both arms, moving like two people who had never sustained a life-altering injury in their lives. When I lowered the phone, Priscilla was watching me with something like sympathy. "There's one more thing," she said, "and I debated whether to tell you, but I think you deserve to know everything." She explained that, while showing them around the previous week, she'd stepped out of the room to take a call and, coming back, had overheard part of a conversation through a half-open door. My father-in-law had been saying something about how kind-hearted people with money are the easiest to manage, and my mother-in-law had laughed and said, "As long as she keeps believing we're helpless, we're fine." We got a good chunk from the settlement, but that's mostly gone now between the kitchen and the new appliances. This house, though, this is the real payoff. I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me. "The settlement," I repeated. "From the accident." That's what I understood, yes. Later, standing frozen in that back room while my husband's laughter drifted in from outside, Priscilla told me the rest, the part that turned my stomach in a way nothing else had. She said she'd heard Barrett mention, during that same overheard conversation, something about how they'd need to lean on my resources going forward once we were settled in the new house, and my mother-in-law had responded, half-lawing, that she could teach her how to fall the right way, implying, unmistakably, that they intended to coach me or manipulate me into faking some kind of injury myself, to open up a new stream of insurance money under my own name. "They want you to think it's a joke if it ever comes out," Priscilla said, "but I don't think it's a joke. I think you need to protect yourself, and I think you need to do it today. I don't remember exactly how I got myself together enough to walk back into that house and act normal for the next 20 minutes. I remember Barrett asking if I was feeling all right. My face must have looked pale, and I told him I had a headache and needed to lie down for a bit. Priscilla, following some cue I hadn't given her, mentioned she needed to speak with my in-laws about scheduling a second walkthrough, giving me the excuse I needed to slip out to my car alone. I texted Barrett that I'd gone ahead home, that my headache had gotten worse, and drove away with my hands locked so tightly on the wheel my knuckles ached. That night, alone in our apartment while Barrett was still out with his parents, celebrating what they all believed was a done deal, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and started digging. I pulled up everything I could find about the original accident. The construction site, the company involved, the settlement records that were technically part of public court filings. I found the name of the insurance company that had handled the disability claims. I looked into whether there were any red flags in their payout history. Then I sat with the 45 seconds of video on my phone, watching it over and over, my mother-in-law's easy stride, my father-in-law's steady gait, until the images stopped feeling surreal and started feeling like evidence. I called the insurance company's fraud investigation line the next morning before Barrett was even awake. I explained everything as calmly as I could manage, the years of claimed mobility issues, the sudden kitchen renovation, the video I'd taken, the overheard conversation Priscilla had relayed to me. The investigator on the line took detailed notes and asked me to email the footage directly to their special investigations unit, which I did that same afternoon, hands still trembling slightly as I hit send. It took almost 6 weeks for everything to unfold. During that time, I said nothing to Barrett, going through the motions of our daily life with a kind of hollow, watchful calm, waiting to see what would happen. And then one evening, 2 investigators showed up at our apartment door with a warrant, and Barrett stood in our living room in complete shock as they explained they needed to speak with him regarding his parents, who had already been taken in for questioning that same afternoon. The investigation revealed a pattern going back nearly a decade. My father-in-law's original injury had been real but relatively minor, a partial tear that should have healed with proper treatment within a year. Instead, with the help of a cousin who worked as a physician's assistant and had access to certain records, they'd continued submitting updated medical documentation exaggerating the extent of the damage, year after year, collecting disability payments and settlement disbursements that had, over time, added up to a staggering sum. The cousin, it turned out, had already been flagged once before for irregular billing practices at another clinic, and was quietly under a different kind of scrutiny that made the fraud case against my in-laws move faster than it otherwise might have. When it all came out, Barrett refused to believe it at first, insisting there had to be some explanation, some misunderstanding, even as the evidence mounted around him. He didn't deny that he'd known. Not fully, not until later. Once I confronted him directly, and he finally admitted, in a low, defeated voice, that he'd started to suspect a few years back but had told himself it wasn't his business, that whatever they were doing, they'd earned some kind of break after everything that had happened to them. "You knew," I said, "and you let me marry into it. You let them plan around me." He didn't have an answer for that. Not a real one. I filed for divorce within the month. He fought it at first. Said it was a misunderstanding. Said his parents deserved a chance to explain themselves to me directly. I had no interest in that conversation. But there was one thing I still needed to say, and so I agreed to visit them once at the county facility where they were being held awaiting trial. Sitting across from my mother-in-law through the reinforced glass, watching her look older and smaller than she had at that kitchen table 3 years earlier, I asked her directly why she'd do it. Why involve me at all? "There really was an accident," she said, her voice thin. "We really were hurt at first. I don't understand why everyone's acting like we did something so terrible. People get by however they can." "You planned to hurt me," I said. "You talked about teaching me how to fake a fall so you could collect off my injury too. That's not getting by. That's a crime, and you tried to make me part of it." She didn't have a real response, just a kind of wounded confusion, as though she genuinely couldn't understand why I was so upset. Barrett, sitting beside her, tried one more time. "You come from money. Your family's never had to worry about any of this. Can't you understand why we did what we had to do?" That was the moment something in me went completely still and clear. "My family worked for everything they have," I said. "So did I. None of us has ever once thought about lying our way into someone else's bank account. What you did isn't survival. It's theft, and you tried to make me complicit in it." I stood up, told them both I never wanted contact again, and walked out without looking back. The divorce was finalized a few months later. Word of the fraud case had spread through Barrett's workplace, and he eventually resigned under the pressure of it, though I heard through mutual friends that he moved out of state not long after his parents were sentenced. I don't know where he is now, and I've stopped wondering. For a long stretch after all of it, I didn't think I'd ever want to get remarried, or even date seriously again. I threw myself into work instead, eventually taking a promotion that meant longer hours, but also, strangely, a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. It was almost a full year before I met someone new, a coworker's neighbor who'd been invited to the same backyard barbecue almost as an afterthought. His name doesn't matter so much as who he turned out to be. Patient in a way that never felt performative, steady, upfront about everything, including his own family, which I quickly learned was about as uncomplicated as families come. When he finally introduced me to his parents, I sat through that first dinner half-braced for something to go wrong, some small detail that would set off the same quiet alarm bells I'd learned to recognize too late the first time. Nothing did. His mother served an enormous pot roast without a single complaint about the cost or effort, laughed easily, asked me real questions about my life, and actually listened to the answers. His father told embarrassing stories about my new partner's childhood, and nobody flinched or deflected or steered the conversation toward what they were owed. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the most reassuring evenings of my life. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony not unlike my first one, except this time it felt entirely different, lighter, honest, built on something I could actually trust. When the subject of buying a house eventually came up between us, I knew exactly which realtor I wanted to call. Walking back into that familiar office, I saw her before she saw me. Same sharp composure, a little more seasoning in her face, a new title on the business card she handed me a moment later. Broker now, not just an agent. It's been a while, she said, breaking into a genuine smile the moment recognition hit her. You look happy. I am, I told her, and meant it completely. Later, while my husband was outside checking the parking situation, she pulled me aside for just a moment, her voice dropping into something more personal. I'm really glad you found someone good, she said. I think about that day a lot, honestly. I'm glad I said something. I'll never be able to thank you enough for that, I told her, and I felt my eyes sting a little, the good kind of overwhelmed. We ended up buying our house through her, a smaller place than the one I'd almost lost myself in years earlier, but one that felt entirely, uncomplicatedly ours. Standing in the empty living room on the day we got the keys, sunlight pouring in through windows that had never seen anyone else's lies, I let myself finally believe that this house, unlike the last one, was exactly what it appeared to be.